Hello and welcome to the Empower Couples podcast, where here you get modern, non-boring relationship advice for you and your partner to communicate like pros, fight smarter, and stay on the same team no matter the challenge that you face. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, and today I'll be welcoming Charles Duhigg, the author and journalist whose work at the New York Times was recognized with a Pulitzer Prize. He has 3 best-selling books, most notably is The Power of Habit, which was on bestseller lists for 3 straight years. Now, he's the author of Supercommunicators. This book came out in 2024. It's unlocking the secret language of connection. And that is what him and I dive into more today. So get ready for becoming a super communicator in your own marriage and deepening your connection with your partner. Well, hello, Charles. Welcome to the Empower Couples podcast. We're really excited to have you on here today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Now, what I'm excited to talk to you about specifically is being a super communicator in your marriage. So I have your book right here, Supercommunicators. So for all of those listening, I really invite you to get a copy of his book here. Because from one logical person, maybe to another, or all the listeners out there, I love the practical tips and tools that any married couple can just take away and implement. So I'm excited to dive into what it's like to be a super communicator in your marriage with you, Charles. And so a number of places I want to go. So I'll just kind of summarize parts of my takeaway of the book. Because communication, as you probably find yourself, can become this soundbite thing online where, oh, the thing you need in your marriage is communication. And it is, but I like how you started out the book immediately saying why communication is so important is because of the connection that it can bring.
Yeah.
So then you talk further about, and this is the part I really started to buy in, right? You need to be able to understand synchronization, and not necessarily so you connect, but understanding this matching principle and what are the 3 types of conversations we could be having. That's where a lot of couples could take a misstep right out of the gate. So let's open up there. Share with me a little bit about how communication leads to connection through the idea of synchronization, but also these 3 types of communication that a couple needs to understand.
My interest in this topic really came out of my own marriage, which is that my wife and I had fallen into this bad pattern, which I think is probably going to be familiar to you and anyone listening, which is I would come home from work and I would start complaining about my day. You know, my boss doesn't appreciate me, or my coworkers don't realize what a genius I am. And my wife really, very practically, she would offer some good advice. She would say, like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better? And instead of being able to hear what she was saying to me, I would get even more upset. And I would say, why aren't you on my side? You're supposed to be supporting me, you're supposed to be outraged. And she would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice. And so I went to these researchers and I asked them, what's going on here? Like, why do I keep falling into this trap where it seems like we're having different kinds of conversations? And they said, well, what's interesting is we're living through this golden age of understanding communication, right? Because of advances in neural imaging and data collection, we can really see what's happening in people's brains for the first time as they talk to each other. And we tend to make this one mistake, which is that when we're having a discussion, we assume we know what that discussion is about, right? We're talking about my day, or we're talking about where to go to dinner, or, what happened with the kids today. But actually, they said, if we look inside your brain, what we see is that every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations, right? And you mentioned the 3 before, because they tend to fall into one of 3 buckets. There's these practical conversations where we're making plans or we're solving problems. But then there's also emotional conversations where I tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize, and I want you to show me that you relate. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other and how we relate to society and the identities that are important to us. And they said, what we've discovered is that if you are having different kinds of conversations at the same moment, you really can't fully hear each other, right? And that's what was happening with my wife and myself. I was having an emotional conversation. She was having a practical conversation. And we were like 2 ships passing in the night. But if you learn to identify what kind of conversation is happening, and if you match each other, if I match you or I invite you to match me, what's known within psychology as the matching principle, then we not only start hearing each other much more clearly, we also feel connected to each other. And that sense of connection is really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think from both of our backgrounds, the way that science and psychology seems to measure marriage is through marriage satisfaction and quality. And whether it's the only thing or not, for sure, connection is a big piece of
Oh,
having
yeah.
high marriage satisfaction and quality. So I really love that you started the book out like that because you really got a sense of it's not just this vague thing, communication and we need connection. It's like, no, that's really what brings about marriage satisfaction and quality. And your first step is can you understand the type of conversation you're having? And when I started to think of this and just look at it in Jocelyn and I's life, how often were we having a different conversation?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it brought me to a number of questions. I think, as you mentioned, let's go there. How do I identify that we're having different conversations? And I think for a lot of couples, it's how do I get back on to the same conversation or the same path with my partner? So
Yeah.
we may have started in this place where we weren't matching with each other. How do I recognize it? And then how do I bring us back?
So the easiest way is just to ask, right? Like when I come home from work and I start complaining, my wife often says like, "Do you want me to help you solve this problem or do you just need to like complain and like listen to me vent?" And I actually appreciate her asking, right? I'm like, "No, no, no, you don't have to worry
Mm,
about it. Like I just want to like get this off my chest." So I think the first thing we can do is we can say to our partner, what kind of conversation are you looking for? Is this a practical thing where you want a solution, or is this emotional where you want to let me know what you feel, or is this social where we need to talk about, how the different perspectives we bring to this? And they actually teach teachers to do this with kids. They teach
mm,
them to ask students at the beginning of a conversation, do you want to be helped? Do you want to be hugged? Or do you want to be heard? Which, of
mm,
course, is the practical, the emotional, and the social. And the reason why that's powerful is because oftentimes our kids know what they want, right? They can tell us. Now, that being said, sometimes, like when we're in a work setting or when passions are high, sometimes it's hard to just ask what kind of conversation are you looking for.
mm,
And so at that moment, we can do two things. The first is we can look for clues, right? Even if this person sounds like they're in a practical mindset, they're very like cut and dry. Are they using emotional words? Are they telling me how they feel? Are they talking about I feel stressed or I got upset when you X? If they're using emotional words, even if they sound very cut and dry, it's a clue that they're having an emotional conversation and we need to match them there,
mm,
right? The other thing we can do is we can ask what are known as deep questions. So, a deep question is something that asks me about my values or my beliefs or my experiences. And that can sound a little bit intimidating when I put it
mm,
like that, but it's as simple as if you meet a doctor, instead of saying, oh, what hospital do you work at? You can ask them, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Right? That second question is a deep question because it invites someone to talk about who they are, how they see the world, why they decided to become a doctor. And we can do the same thing with our spouses, right? We can say, look, this seems like it's something really important to you. Tell me, why is this important to you? What about this is, feels important and vital to you? That's a deep question. And what we're going to find is that when we ask a question like that, they're going to answer in a way that tells us what kind of mindset they're in. They're going to
mm,
either use practical words, like they're like, well, we just like we need to set a plan for like, our vacation. I want to buy tickets. Okay, it's practical mindset.
mm,
Or they might say, no, like I'm kind of stressed out about the budget because like, if we plan this fancy vacation, like how are we going to afford it and what with the kids' braces coming up? Okay, that's much more of an emotional conversation. They're using words like stress, worried. So I think that's the thing is to ask questions and then listen.
mm-hmm. I want to take a quick pause from this conversation with Charles because he just brings up such a good point that we hear from couples that are now parents all the time. And Jocelyn and I were at a birthday party this past week. And I was talking to the husband, who's also a friend of mine, and he was just saying how much his marriage has changed since having kids. And both of his kids are young, similar to our daughter. And he just feels that there's just obviously, not enough time, but that he feels that he's more second fiddle, that he doesn't get the amount of effort and attention or priority or amount of real love deposits towards him that it's obviously all about the kids and he's a far thought after that. And we hear this from couples all the time. I mean, this is something that we've really focused on in our own marriage once having our daughter. And yes, we are all limited with our time. And even if you run a business or you're just a busy couple that doesn't have kids, we are constrained on this time. And that's why we want to talk about the Prioritizing Us Couples Challenge. You've probably heard us talk about it before. It's a 30-day challenge where we're going to send you dedicated daily emails for 30 days in a row. And in this challenge, which is our level one, it is really about activities that you do to add to your love accounts in your marriage to communicate. We give you practical tips. It's almost like you're getting coaching from us specifically every single day. But the point is that you can, even when you're busy, busy lives, busy as parents, you can take these actions and add to the love account, to the amount of love and connection that you feel with your partner. And you don't have to necessarily even think about it. You get the activity from us and then you implement it. And of the 40,000 couples that have gone through this challenge, we get so many messages that say, I really feel that our love account, our feeling of connection is so much higher. And even with that, you then have so much more grace and relatability and just love that is present even with the busyness and the challenges. So our challenge, the Prioritizing Us Couples Challenge, starts in just a few days. So go to mycoupleschallenge.com, get yourself registered. You can add your partner for free. They'll get the emails as well, so you can both head down this path. So we're excited to have you in that challenge. It makes such a huge difference in your love and connection. Now let's dive back into this great conversation here with Charles. Something else I was thinking of, not only while you were talking, but again, reading through the book, how often do you think, let's call it the speaker, because we talk a lot about just the speaker and listener roles. How often do you think the speaker is aware of the conversation they're having or even desire to be having?
Well, I mean, I think that someone who's a super communicator, I think they're thinking about it a lot, right? They
Mm,
go before they open their mouth, they know why they're opening their mouth.
mm,
Now, you're right. Sometimes we like get into conversations without like really asking ourselves why I'm in this conversation. And most of the time that's fine, right? Like if you're just like watching TV or having dinner with your spouse and you sort of like want to just like chew the fat and talk about your day, you don't have to like interrogate yourself and them about what kind of conversation is going on. You know, right? This is just relaxing. This is probably a social conversation where we're talking about like what our days were like. But I think that in general, anytime we want to have an important discussion,
mm,
what we should do is we should sit down and figure out like why am I having this discussion? What's my goal? Like what am I hoping to get out of this? And in fact, there's been a bunch of experiments, including at Harvard Business School, that show that sitting down and just jotting down like a couple of things that you want to talk about helps clarify for you why this is important. And even more importantly, when they've done experiments, they've asked students before having a conversation with a stranger to write down three things they might talk about.
mm,
And then they ask them afterwards, did those topics come up? And the students will say things like, no, actually, I wrote down three things. I stuck them in my back pocket and they never came up. But I felt so much more confident and relaxed in that conversation because I
mm,
I, I kind of knew that I had these three things in my pocket that I could pull out at any time. And I kind of knew why I was having this conversation, what I hoped to get from talking to someone I haven't met before. Just the smallest amount, like 10 seconds of asking ourselves, why am I doing this can have a huge, huge impact.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. That brings me to like another sort of part of the connection, right? Because a lot of the couples that come to us and we have a number of these 30-day challenges. So a lot of people are asking us about how do I create connection? And I
Mhm.
think to your point, it's not necessarily something that we are focusing on all the time because we're communicating about roles and responsibilities. I'm just sharing about my day. And it's probably more so when you get off and you see that, man, maybe we're not matching here. I can think about what type of conversation, what outcome do I need to ask a deep conversation? And then it becomes more intentional. So how do I intentionally create more connection with my partner? And it led me then to another good part of your book, right, which is about this cycle where you have you can bring about vulnerability, right? And if I bring vulnerability to the conversation, then this, you said triggers, but I also like the word elicits, right? But it allows for emotional contagion, and that's probably a new conversation or a new term for the listeners. But then that elicits that connection, which prompts more questions, and that creates vulnerability. So if
Yeah.
I'm trying as a listener to create more connection with my partner in the day to day, talk a little bit about how I can utilize this cycle here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think at the core of this is vulnerability, right? And we tend to misunderstand what vulnerability is. We think of vulnerability as like, crying on each other's shoulder or talking about how awful our parents were or something like that. That's actually not vulnerability. Vulnerability is a very specific neurological state that occurs when I say something that you could judge. Now,
Mm.
I might not care about your judgment, right? I might tell you that I think Star Wars is better than Star Trek. And you think I'm totally wrong because you like Captain Kirk more than Luke Skywalker. And you think that I'm wrong for thinking that. And I don't care. It's like not an important thing. But the act of telling you something that you can judge, it puts me in a vulnerable state. It sets off a neural cascade that makes me feel vulnerable. And at that moment, because of evolution, I'm going to pay very close attention to how you react. And if instead of judging me when you have the option to do so, if instead of doing so, you withhold judgment, or even more powerfully, if you share something about yourself that I in turn could judge about you, when we do that, what we're actually doing is we are creating vulnerability, a sense of vulnerability between us that we are powerless not to feel closer to each other. Right? Now, we might walk away completely disagreeing with each other. We might have different opinions on movies and politics and sports and anything. But if I've given you a chance to judge me and you've withheld judgment, and then you've shared something about yourself and I've withheld judgment, we feel connected to each other. And that's why oftentimes you have friends or people you meet who you don't agree with, right? You see the world differently than they do, but you still feel close to them and you still feel connected to them and you still like them. It's because both of you are being vulnerable and the other person isn't using that as an opportunity to judge or attack.
Mm.
And when it comes to couples, this is really important, right? Because the truth of the matter is, nobody agrees with their partner 100%. There are always things that we're going to disagree with. It can be as dumb as like, you want Chinese for dinner and I want Indian. Or it can be as big as you voted for your guy and I voted for my woman, right? And yet, as long as we withhold judgment and we make the other person feel like we are trying to connect with them, we're trying to hear what's important to them, then we don't have to agree with each other. The agreement is not what makes us feel connected. It's the withholding judgment that makes us feel connected.
Hmm. Would you use the term acceptance? Would you use that kind of as synonyms?
No, I don't, because I don't have to. You don't have to accept the other person. You just have to withhold judgment, right? Like if you say you voted for someone different than I voted with, I might say like, okay, like I want to understand why. I might not feel like I completely accept your reasons. I might not feel like I have to accept your decision. But I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to argue with you. I'm not going to try and prove I mean, or unless we're having a conversation where we are just sharing our feelings or our thoughts on politics. But what's important is that I'm not cutting you off. My goal is to understand you.
Hmm.
If I think that you want to understand me, I feel connected to you.
Hmm. The replies that we get a lot from listeners of the podcast or those that like start our challenge, right, are usually, and it's kind of funny sometimes, it's usually in the realm of, man, I'm like really getting this idea. And it's like, how do I get my partner to listen to this podcast or read this book or do this challenge? Because I feel like I'm doing these things right. And how how do I get my partner to start judging me, right? So if I'm a listener and I'm now trying to create more connection with my partner, and I feel I'm being vulnerable, where I'm bringing to the table something that I could be judged by, and I feel like my partner is judging me. We'll
Yeah.
we'll go on a tangent of like perception here, but what would you give to someone that's really saying, I'm trying to be vulnerable, but I do feel a judgment from my partner, and that's kind of the barrier we can't get past to creating this connection.
I mean, the first thing to do is to literally say what you just said to your partner, right? I mean, think about how powerful it is when someone says, "I'm trying to be vulnerable with you," and I feel like you're judging me. Like that's actually the most powerful thing we can say. So a lot of communication is not like some secret hack or like some trick that works. A lot of communication is literally just communicating, right? Knowing enough about ourselves and more importantly having the vocabulary,
Mm,
right? Cuz sometimes people feel vulnerable but they don't really recognize what that sense of vulnerability is. They think that vulnerability is like crying. But like actually just saying like I feel vulnerable because I'm telling you this thing and I know you could judge it
mm,
and I actually feel like you are judging me a little bit, and I really want you to understand why I feel this.
mm,
Like that's really, really powerful. But the other thing is, when we want to connect with someone and we're having trouble doing so, it's often because we want to tell them something rather than we want to listen from them about something. We want to hear them. So if I sit down and I say, I've got some real issues and I want you to hear them, and I want to be vulnerable, I'm going to tell you things you could judge, but like, here's what you're doing wrong and here's what I need from you. That's not really a conversation, right? That's a monologue where the other person has like a script on how they're supposed to respond. A conversation is a dialogue. And if I want you to listen to me, I need to show you that I'm going to listen to you, which means I need to start by asking you questions rather than telling you my truths, asking you what's going on with you, what's going on in your head.
hmm
And if I don't show any of that curiosity about you, why should you be curious about me?
mm. This is a good transition to the other major point I want to bring up from super communicators, and that's control.
Hmm.
So, talk a little bit about how control is one of the biggest barriers to connection and sometimes to even communicate more, right? Like we do a lot of assessments and we can see couples levels of, what's called assertiveness. We can also get a sense of the term that's used is dominance, but it's kind of like that feeling of being controlled, right? So
Right.
it's an interesting cycle when I think of it too. It's if I'm trying to be vulnerable and I'm still feeling judged, or my partner is telling me how I need to change, I can start to feel this sense of control. And it's more like I start to maybe withdraw, I start to communicate less. Obviously, then you when you pull either attention or physical proximity away, it's right. It's like there's not connection there.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about first in general how this idea of control is one of the biggest barriers to connection and like how do I start to break through that? And then maybe we'll conclude with perception versus like actual domination and control.
Sure. So, so a couple of decades ago, m- people who research marriage therapy and research marriages had this basic question, which is why do some couples fight and it doesn't damage the relationship, and other couples fight and it basically like is toxic? Because and at first they thought that maybe it was because some couples just fight more than others. And there is some variability in how much people fight, but the truth of the matter is that every couple has fights, right? Every couple has arguments, and that's just part of being in a relationship. So it's not that. And in fact, when they looked at the fights, they thought that, well, okay, so maybe the toxic fights are about money and really hard topics, and
Mm,
the good fights are about like where to go on vacation and like what to eat for dinner. Turns out that's not true at all. Basically, everyone argues about the same stuff in the same proportion. So they tried to figure out, so what's going on here? They watched a bunch of people who fought and basically didn't have any impact on the relationship, and a bunch of people who fought and it did. It oftentimes led to real toxicity or divorce. And they discovered that one of the biggest differences, as you pointed out, is control. Whenever I'm in a fight, whenever you're in a fight, whenever any of us are in a fight, and we have that fight or flight instinct that gets triggered, our first instinct is to try and control something, right? Because being in control of something, just one thing, makes us feel like we have some agency. It makes us feel better. It makes us feel like we can be less scared. And the most obvious thing to control is the person sitting across from me, the person I'm fighting with. And so oftentimes people do things where they try and control the other person without even realizing it. They say things like, I'm not going to talk about that. Like you always bring up,
Mm-hmm.
going to my mother's house. I'm not going to talk about that. They try and control what the conversation is about. Or they say things like, oh, you got upset about that? You shouldn't get upset about that. That's not like nothing to get upset about. They're trying to control the other person's emotions. This trying to control the other person is very toxic. This is what the bad couples, the couples that where fights sort of spiraled out of control, this is one of the things that they were doing. The most important thing is they were trying to control each other. And if you try and control me, particularly when we're arguing with each other, I'm just going to hate it. And I'm going to try and control you back. And you're going to hate that too. And all of a sudden, everything's going to start escalating. So, what the good couples did is what's interesting, they still felt the same instinct for control, right? It's a totally natural instinct. All of us feel it when we're feeling threatened. But instead of trying to control the other person, they would try and find things that they could control together. So, for instance, they would try and control the timing. They would say things like, look, instead of like arguing about this at midnight, like, why don't we both go to bed? We'll get a good night's sleep. We'll talk about it tomorrow morning when we're both well rested and like the sun is up, right? And that's something we can control together. We're going to control the environment for this discussion together. Or they might try and control the parameters of the discussion. There's this pattern known as kitchen sinking. That's like probably the number one most toxic pattern in a relationship, which is when a fight about one thing becomes a fight about everything. So
Mm-hmm.
we start by talking about like arguing about like where should we go for Thanksgiving, and then eventually it becomes like your mom doesn't like me and I don't like her, and if you earned enough money we would be able to afford going to Thanksgiving more easily, right? It becomes a fight about everything, and it just be like, and it's just awful. It's like scorched earth. So what another thing that good couples do is that they try and control the boundaries of the discussion together. They say like, okay, let's talk about Thanksgiving. Let's not talk about moms. Let's not talk about money. We can have those conversations some other time. Let's just figure out where we're going to spend Thanksgiving, right? Now, the reason why this is so powerful is because when you and I are trying to control things together, we are on the same side at the table.
Mm-hmm.
So even though we're arguing with each other, even though we disagree with each other, we are finding these little things where we can signal to each other, I am in accordance with you. I want to work with you. I want to find ways for us to cooperate. And that's really, really powerful. So what it does is it takes this instinct we have for control that can be very toxic and it subverts it into something that's really positive for us because it gives us a way to cooperate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. We're big on repair. So we have a, repair process, which our listeners are really familiar with. And in there, we talk about in step 4, making agreements, right? So
Mhm.
that's really the term that we have for everything you mentioned. How do we create the parameters or the boundaries? And we like to think of that in terms of you can have a conflict come up, and if you can take a pause, if you can say, hey, let's tackle this tomorrow morning, we regulate our emotions, then where we can really start is we can determine kind of where we went off path and what are the agreements we can put in place for conflicts in the future so that we don't have some of these main call them triggers take us down this path where, as you said, we kitchen sink each other because no one wants
Yeah.
to be a part of that.
Right.
And I think for us, a big part of understanding how conflict can actually be a benefit, it's like there's so much you can learn inside of a conflict.
Yeah.
So anything in particular that maybe you found that might be new for our listeners, and if it's really all about this learning about each other, learning about how to be vulnerable, how not to judge, learning how to get on the same page with what's the type of conversation we're having, right? What are some of the big lessons you've seen people take away from even getting into conflict? And then, wow, this actually makes us better as a couple.
Yeah. So I think the first thing is oftentimes we're in conflict because we're having different kinds of conversations without realizing it or without acknowledging it. right? Let's take conversations about money, right? It's the number one thing that couples fight about is money. And when a conversation about money starts, it oftentimes sounds like a practical conversation. I want to figure out the budget, or I want to figure, or we're overspending on this credit card. I want to bring down our spending. That sounds very cut and dry. But if you just ask one of those deep questions, if you just say, okay, look, let's take a step back. Like, tell me, this obviously is something that's been bothering you. Tell me why it's bothering you. Tell me what's going on. Like, why is this important to you? And then you listen closely, you're going to hear them tell you whether this is an emotional conversation they need to have or a practical conversation, right? It sounded really practical before, but they say things like, I'm really worried that if we continue spending this way, we're not going to have anything for retirement. Okay, that word worried, that tells me we need to have an emotional conversation before we can move on to the practical, right? I need to let you know I hear your anxieties and I understand your anxieties, and your anxieties are completely legitimate. I probably share them myself. We are on the same side of the table. Let's talk about those anxieties. And then once we've talked about them, I might say, look, I feel like I understand how you feel about this. Can we talk about some plans going forward? In other words, can we move from an emotional to a practical conversation? And what you'll find is that when we identify what kind of conversation we're having, it makes a lot of those conflicts disappear. Because otherwise, and sometimes you'll say, like, why is this so important to you? And they'll just say, look, like it's kind of a hassle for me to have to pay the credit card bill like this every month. Like, if we're going to spend that money, I'd rather pay it in a check because that way, some of it in a check so that way I can track it through the bank account. Okay, they're not an emotional mindset, right? They're not having to have emotional conversation. This is genuinely a practical conversation. And you could say, okay, let's figure out a plan, right? The key is to ask more questions. One of the things that we know about consistent super communicators, and all
Mm,
of us are super communicators at one time or another, but people who do this consistently, people who manage to connect with anyone, is that they ask more questions than the average person, like 10 to
mm,
20 times more questions than the
wow.
average person. And a lot of those questions are deep questions, right? And a deep question is ultimately always asking, tell me why this is important to you. Tell me how you see the world. Tell me what matters about this conversation to you. When we ask that kind of question, then we invite the other person to genuinely share with us. And when they do so and we withhold judgment, and even better, when we share something with them in return, again, even if we disagree with each other, we are going to feel closer to each other. We're going to feel more connected. We're going to feel like we're cooperating.
Hmm. This was a perfect transition to end us because I was going to ask, and we kind of all know the answer, but is being a super communicator in marriage something you arrive at or something that you have to always put effort into?
Yeah. No, I would love it. Or if someone was born like what there's this kind of myth that, like communicators are born, not made, that you're
Mm,
born with a gift of the gab or you're born with charisma. That's not true at all. Actually, experiment after experiment shows that is not accurate. The best communicators are people who think a lot about communication. They're people
mm,
who practice communication. They're people who understand if you try something and it doesn't work, that doesn't mean that you're bad at this. That means you just need to try something else. You need to continue practicing, right? We would never expect that someone would be like a world-class chef the first time they walked into a kitchen. So why do we expect that you would be a world-class communicator the first time you walk into a tough conversation in your relationship? The way that we learn to do it is by practicing. And literally anyone can become a super communicator. It's just a matter of practicing it. And in relationships, this is particularly important.
hmm.
It's so helpful just to sometimes say in a relationship, I feel like we're not hearing each other as much as I wish we were. Right? Let's talk about how how do we hear each other better? How
Hmm.
do we make it easier for us to share what's really important to us and what's going on inside our head? Just asking that, saying, I want to talk about communication, I want to communicate about communication, that can work wonders.
Yeah. So it did bring me to one last question. So,
Sure.
so we'll close out with this. Motivation. Because I love everything you said, your book, it's so practical. And I think, sometimes for couples that have been together for a long time, right? And there has been some judgment, there's been a lack of repair. there's even the perception of judgment over time, right? The longer we're together, it's easy to think that our partners judge us about certain things, and we can start to feel even rejected or punished by them, right? And that's just kind of a natural thing we have to be more cognizant and aware of, that just happens. But a lot of couples will start to feel a little bit drained, a little bit discouraged. And I think that what that is there becomes a lack of motivation or remembering why I should continue to put this kind of effort into being a super communicator. So just kind of closing this out as a good reminder, what's the motivation that a couple in that space should remember? Why should I seek to be a good super communicator?
The thing I would say is if you are feeling unmotivated, just to have a few kind of fun conversations with your spouse, right? Yeah, I mean, you married them for a reason. You probably enjoy hanging out with them like once or twice, right? And the thing that you'll find is our brains have evolved to not only be really good at communication, but to crave it and to crave connection. You know that good feeling you get like after a really good conversation? That's actually your brain is releasing dopamine and
Mm,
and serotonin. We have our brains are hardwired to want to connect with other people. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves of that. Sometimes it can get really hard because we're busy and the kids and X and Y and jobs and X and Y and Z. And every conversation we have is about like pragmatics, like logistics, like, who's going to pick up the kids and who's going to pay the credit card bill. Those aren't necessarily fun conversations. And so, but if you just take a break and say, like, look, tonight, let's just like you and me, we'll leave the kids in front of the TV, make a nice dinner, we'll have a glass of wine. Let's just talk about like anything. We'll talk about TV shows we like. We'll talk about like our favorite vacation that we've taken together. Once we remind ourselves how much we enjoy connecting with this other
mhm,
person, our brain knows what to do. Our brain is hardwired to do it. It will click into gear and it will help us connect with each other. And that connection means that the next time something tough comes up, it's going to be easier for us to cooperate on it. It's going to be easier for us to be vulnerable with each other. It's going to be easier for us to connect, even if the tough thing remains tough.
mm. Well, Charles, thank you so much. I love the balance of the logic, the structure, the motivation, and just a reminder that it's not something that we're born with necessarily, that we can all be super communicators and we all want to because we're hardwired for connection. So, Charles, thank you so much for being on here. And everyone's Super Communicators is available. It was out in 2024, and really invite everyone to get a copy of that book. And again, Charles, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.